This week on Horse Around with Horsepower, we're talking about the French Grand Prix. And this week's episode is going to be a bit different because we do not have our usual guests joining us. And we're also in the middle of sort of developing new formats that we hope you guys will enjoy for the podcast. And that said, I do have my good friends, Henil and Max, joining us as always. Hi, guys.
Hello, indeed. Welcome.
Hi.
Now, I'm afraid I'm going to have to start this week's episode with a bit of a bad news. Because, as you guys may have heard, we've entered a podcast competition, and we're doing pretty well in it. We're like 73 out of 900 something participants, so that's pretty good. But I was just taking a quick look at the contestants that were ahead of us, and there's this podcast called Frog of the Week, where a person literally talks about a different kind of frog each week. And somehow they are like 20 something places ahead of us. And we cannot afford to lose to a podcast about frogs. And I would implore you guys that if you haven't already done so, to just head over to the link in our Instagram bio and drop a quick word for us because it will really help us and we would really appreciate it.
And if you vote for us, we can, improve our audio quality and deliver even better content for you guys that's more pleasing to the ears. So yeah, please vote for us if you haven't done so already.
Also, for those of you who are wondering what frog of the week for this week, it's some frog called the barking tree frog, which is apparently the biggest frog in US and lives in coastal areas and comes in different colors or something like that. So, yeah. But enough about frogs. Let's talk about the French Grand Prix. That's what we're all here for. So, Henil, why don't you start walking us through what happened on the weekend?
Sure, Jishnu. I think free practice was very interesting because after two back-to-back races in street circuits, we were back to a more permanent racetrack. Although there are so many reiterations possible, we were still on a permanent racetrack. And free practice was quite interesting because seeing the drivers adapt to this a permanent racetrack was proved to be quite a challenge for quite a few of them actually. Especially in the beginning, we could see Sainz and Mazepin spinning out in free practice 1, bringing out the yellow flags at one point because Sainz actually veered off the track, spun out into the blue and red zones, which for those of you who weren't really paying close attention during free practice and the race, each of the red and the blue zones are actually differing levels of grip to slow down the drivers if they do manage to veer off the track the way Sainz did, for example, and to prevent them from crashing into the barriers at a high speed. So if you compare the flat spots on Sainz's tires compared to Verstappen's tires when Verstappen spun out in Baku and crashed, you can actually see that Sainz's tires were actually quite a lot more damaged, and that was due to the red stripes being so much grippier and so much rougher. Once again, seeing the drivers actually being able to adapt quite quickly, it's quite clear evidence as to why they're racing at the level that they are and why they're getting paid the big bucks because with just a few days in the simulator, they were able to go back to the racing mindset of a permanent racetrack. So that was fun. I think the only complaint that I had was, no grass or gravel for the runoff areas with more tarmac. But I think more on that later. Practice was quite fun to watch.
Yeah, but it wasn't just the gravel traps or the red and blue stripes that were slowing down these drivers, the sausage curbs, or as Aaron Chaddock rightly pointed out, the baguette curbs, since it's the French Grand Prix.
Yeah.
They actually caused some major wing damage to Red Bull. I think we're talking about the baguette curbs in turn 2. And when Max Verstappen couldn't keep his car on track, he had to run over these curbs. And part of his front wing actually just broke off and fell out. And what was funny was that Red Bull actually radioed in to the FIA, to the race director, Michael Massey, to ask if they could have that bit of front wing back, because they were running short of carbon bodyworks in the factory, which I thought was rather strange. And I guess it makes sense with the new cost caps and all that. But another interesting aspect for me in the that I noticed in free practice was actually the pit lane exit and the location of it, but in particular, relative to the main track. And if you look at it, the pit lane exit is actually right smack in the middle of the braking zone into turn 1 when you're following the racing line. And what that means is that when drivers are coming along in their hot laps and the flying laps during qualifying or during the race or wherever, they're going to be running right into the pit lane exit to brake and enter turn 1.
Yeah.
And that puts the drivers exiting the pit lane in major risk because they need to constantly look into their mirrors to make sure that they're not getting in the way of someone who's flying past them. If not, this is going to end up having a massive crash. And I think Yuki Tsunoda actually had a pretty scary moment, and it definitely scared me because if it was me, I probably wouldn't have checked my mirrors like I often do, and would have been a massive crash. But it was a bit surprising to see. Fortunately, it didn't cause any accidents during the race or during the qualifying, so that's always good. But after the free practice sessions, we had qualifying on a Saturday, and this was actually quite interesting qualifying, I must say, because we actually had 2 red flags, which is quite unusual. But I guess since it's 2021 and we've had plenty of red flags this year, it's quite a normal thing to see. But anyway, Yuki Tsunoda brought up the first set of red flags when he crashed almost immediately into qualifying 1, and he was just about to start his flying lap. And after turn 1, he got through turn 1, but he took a bit too much of the curb on the apex, and he just lost control of the car and spun out, crashing into the barriers, and that instantly brought out the red flags. And while going over the curbs, he actually managed to damage some of his bodywork, and in particular, I think the left rear suspension got seriously damaged because there was some of these bouncy bits on the track, for lack of better words, that caused his suspension to just give way, and he had what that meant was actually he wasn't able to get into qualifying again to produce any more laps. And he also was given a race penalty, and he had to start at the pit lane because he needed to make some replacements to some of the components of his car. And this was actually his second crash in qualifying 1, which was surprising to see because he had quite a lot of expectations put on him, on his young shoulders. And while it wasn't so nice to see, it did mean that the other drivers also suffered because Lance Stroll and Kimi Raikkonen in particular weren't able to put in their flying laps later on in the qualifying session because of another red flag that was actually brought out by Mick Schumacher. And this happened somewhere around turn 4, turn 5, and he also lost control of the car, spun out, and ended up in the barriers. And naturally, they had to red flag the session because it just wasn't safe enough to recover the vehicles on track, and they had to bring out the red flags. And what this meant was that there was very little time for both Lance Stroll and Kimi Raikkonen to put in their laps that they needed to get into Q2. And Mick Schumacher, however, with his time that he had previously put in, managed to get into Q2, which was nice to see a Haas in some contention after plenty of races where they were just out of sight and out of mind, honestly.
Yeah.
And so that led us into Q2. Q2, not really much of a dramatic qualifying session. The people that we expected to get through got through. And I think what was interesting to note is that all of the people who got into Q2 actually got through Q1. Sorry, they all got through on the set of medium tires, and I think none of them actually wanted to risk taking in the soft tires for the start of the race. And this is actually a rule that those drivers that actually get past Q2 into Q1, qualify in the top 10 positions, they're supposed to start their race on the same set of tires using which they set the fastest lap in Q2.
Yeah.
And I think none of the drivers wanted to risk with the soft tires given that the degradation was actually quite high during the race itself. And after Q2, we had Q1, which was quite exciting because we didn't really know who was going to be on pole. We've always thought that France was a Mercedes track, but in the recent races, we've seen that Red Bull are actually really strong. And that proved for a very good battle in qualifying, and rightly so, because we ended up having Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton put in very close lap times, but somehow in the last flying lap, Max Verstappen managed to pull out 2.5 tenths on Lewis Hamilton, which I thought was just incredible, and that was a very good effort by him. And Lewis Hamilton, I think, credited it to the straight line speeds of Red Bull in this race, which was frankly quite unexpected. And what it did make was it made for a very interesting grid lineup because we had the Red Bull of Max Verstappen in P1, followed by the 2 Mercedes, and then the Red Bull of Sergio Perez, who had managed to qualify on P4.
It was a Red Bull sandwich.
Yeah.
And honestly, right, after looking at the Red Bull sandwich, I think P5, I believe, was Carlos Sainz, and then we had Pierre Gasly, Charles Leclerc, Lando Norris, Fernando Alonso, and Daniel Ricciardo. So McLaren's didn't do as well as they were hoping to in qualifying, coming P8 and P10, while during free practice they were actually in the top 5. I think Ricciardo was in the top 5 once, Norris in P6 and then P8 once. So, having shown quite the potential during free practice, they did underperform of sorts. However, I think, as Jishnu rightly mentioned, it was a very, very interesting grid lineup to see there being a Red Bull sandwich from P1 to P4, and France's start having such a long straight before the first corner. It was always going to be an interesting rush to turn one, and the race I think began fairly so with quite an interesting start. Max not keeping his eye out, or Max losing his rear into turn one, had to power start into the turn, kind of went out wide in turn two, and then lost the place to Hamilton within within two corners. Very, very surprising to say. And then the battle was ensued. But then I think a very, very interesting thing that happened was tire degradation. I think Hamilton was complaining about how hot the tires went into it in the sixth lap. So I think Max was raising it up, rightly so. So Max, you want to tell us about it?
Yep, indeed. So apart from the intense battle between Verstappen and Hamilton as the main highlight, in fact, actually the next highlight of the race would be the number of complaints and feedback from all the drivers about the tire degradation and the graining of their tires, about how their tires were wearing out more than they expected to be. But before we dive too deep into the details, we need to first understand, what are the different tire compounds, how do the tires work, and what are all the meanings of, the jargons like graining, marbling, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So, firstly, to begin, we need to understand that in Formula 1, there are 5 dry tire compounds, denoted C1 to C5, with C1 being the hardest tire, meaning it provides the least amount of grip, but it also is the most durable. And while C5 being the softest, sacrificing its durability for having the most grip out of all 5 of them. So you can see these 5 tire compounds as forming a sliding scale of durability and grip levels. So in a normal race weekend, per rally, the tire manufacturer will actually nominate 3 of the tire compounds to be run at each race. Now out of these 3, the hardest compound will be named the hard tire for the weekend and be denoted by a white sidewall. The medium will be denoted by yellow, and the softest will be denoted by a red sidewall. So now, with this knowledge on the different compounds of tires, then we can actually go in to understand how the tires actually work. So F1 tires are actually designed to operate in the optimal temperature range.
Okay.
This is because only between this temperature range does the rubber get soft and sticky enough for it to actually make a difference in the amount of grip the tire provides. So what happened in the France Grand Prix was that the top layer of the rubber, of the tire actually, shall I say, was not warming as fast enough. And what this caused is that because it's not as sticky, it causes the car to slide. And this further increases the temperature of the top layer of the rubber, but not the inner layer of the tire.
Oh.
The inner layer generally heated up by the brakes radiating their heat into the rims, and then the rims then in turn heat up the inner inside of the tire.
Okay.
So this uneven heating essentially makes it easier for the top layer to separate from the lower layer. You can kind of envision it as where you're trying to eat an ice cream and you're just sticking it out of the freezer, and instead of letting it cool down gradually, you just touch the top and then start scraping it at the top of it. Same thing. And this results in the top layer separating from the lower layer, and you will see that tiny packs of rubber, called marbles, they will start to fly out of the tire or actually eat into the tire and stay on the tire itself. This causes the tire to actually have a reduction in grip levels because the tire is no longer in direct contact with the ground but via the marbles. And so this whole process is known as graining. Now, if this graining is not too severe and the inner tire is brought up to the temperature gradually, the driver can then drive through this graining phase. And when the whole tire is warm enough such that the marbles are then melted into the layer again, then the tires can be used as normal.
I see. So, am I right to assume that when a tire grains, because of all these bits and pieces that are sticking out or maybe jutting in from the tire, there's lesser contact, the surface area in contact between the tire and the roads are actually lesser, which results in lower grip.
Yes, essentially, to sum it up, you're right. That is what happens
I see.
when a tire grains. Conversely, if a tire gets too hot, it generally refers to the situation where the rubber has been heated up so much, such that not only the tires become so soft and sticky, but it becomes extremely soft and extremely sticky, such that it becomes way too easy for the rubber to stick to the asphalt and literally be ripped from the tire. And this process is known as blistering, and you can actually see pieces of tire falling, large chunks of it falling off the tires. So it is only when the tire is in the ideal temperature range that it can be soft and sticky enough to provide the best grip for the car.
I see.
Yep, and the ideal temperature range is actually the key word, isn't it? Because we saw in the French Grand Prix that we actually had a couple of factors affecting this ideal temperature range, like you said. There was, the wet weather that just happened before the race. There was a lot of rain. The F3 cars were running over the rain, and they sort of made the whole track green. And what it means for a track to be green is that all the rubber that's laid down by the cars as they run through the weekend actually gets washed away by the rain. And what this leaves us with is a clean track surface. Well, I say clean, but it's actually full of all these bits and pieces of tarmac that are actually sticking out. And while it looks very smooth on the surface on a macro level, if you get into the micro level, it actually becomes very sharp, and that compounded with the fact that FIA and Pirelli had actually increased the tire pressure regulations for this weekend, following the tire blowouts in Azerbaijan. The increase of the tire pressures actually led to even smaller contact surface area between the tires and the road, and all these things actually contribute to the track temperature and the tire temperature, which like Max said, actually contributed to all these grainings because the tire is not in the ideal temperature range. And so, Henil, why don't you tell us actually how these ideal temperature range, the graining, and all these things actually, how did they affect the strategy, the undercuts and overcuts that were going on in the Grand Prix?
Sure. I mean, okay, so I think the biggest reason why there were so many overtakes happening in this race was because of, it was more so the undercut and overcuts that were actually affecting a lot of the strategies and a lot of the race positions. So what does track position mean? It means that when you are out, when you're racing and you're in a current position, let's say, we'll give you an example of Leclerc and Ricciardo for this case. Ricciardo actually overtook Leclerc before he pitted, and Ricciardo was in P8, whereas Leclerc was in P9 at that point. When Leclerc then pitted earlier than Ricciardo, which is colloquially referred to as undercut in F1, he came out P14. And then when Ricciardo pitted, he actually came out behind Leclerc, even though he was ahead of Leclerc before Leclerc pitted. So this is a successful undercut where you pit earlier than someone, and when the person that you're competing against pits after you actually manage to get out in front. So how does this happen? Some of you may ask. Basically, what happened was when you're out longer because of the graining and the blistering and the green track in Paul Ricard, your tire degradation is quite high, which means that you have lower grip, which means that you have to go slow around corners and you lose lap times. So with Ricciardo being out for 2 to 3 laps longer than Leclerc in this example, he was going slower and slower because of the lowering grip conditions. Whereas Leclerc, after his lap into the pits, he came out on fresher tires, which means that not only were they almost in the optimum tire range, optimum temperature because of the blankets that are wrapped on these wheels, they were also quite fresh, meaning that they had a lot more grip available to the car. Another factor that played into this strategy was the fact that the track was getting more and more rubbered in, which meant that more grip was available for the fresher tires, and Leclerc was actually able to speed up quite a bit, or gain lap times over Ricciardo, and was actually then able to undercut Ricciardo successfully. So this was again seen in quite a few examples. I think we saw that with Verstappen mainly, undercutting Hamilton in the first time after Hamilton overtook Verstappen in the second turn of the first lap. Verstappen pitted a bit, I think 1 or 2 laps earlier than Hamilton. He managed to have a blistering pace on his out lap, which is his lap after he came out of the pits, and his in lap, which is the lap when he came into the pits, was also quite a bit faster than Lewis Hamilton. So with that being said, even though the pit stop from Verstappen was slightly slower than Hamilton's pit stop, because Verstappen had that much of a pace advantage in his out and in lap. The undercut by Red Bull actually worked out. This was also seen by Aston Martin, who had a brilliant race weekend with their brilliant strategies as well, starting with hard tires from the beginning and outlasting every single car on the grid. Lance Stroll, even though he started in the pit lane, even though he started 19th, actually managed to make up 9 spaces by the end of the Grand Prix, and Vettel managed to make up 4 to 5 spaces because they were able to overcut everyone else. So basically, overcut is the opposite of undercut, because Aston Martin went out so long, in the first. I think they went almost 60% of the race on their hard tires. When they came out of the pits later on, they were on medium tires. They were fresher towards the end of the Grand Prix. So while the people who pitted early, like Leclerc and Ricciardo, they were on hard tires. They had to last them all the way from the time they pitted all the way to the end. Vettel and Stroll, and those who managed to overcut successfully, were actually on a lot fresher tires towards the end of the race, which meant that they could catch up to the back of the field and overtake people a lot quicker. So that is how basically the undercut and overcut worked out in this race.
I see. So I guess we can see it's not just the drivers or the car itself, but actually also boils down to the strategy that the teams employ that can help determine the outcome and the winner of each race.
Yeah, it is very true. And, that actually brings back to another point that Red Bull actually, pulled on Mercedes. They actually pulled an Uno reverse because 2 races ago in Spain, 3 to 4 races ago in Spain, I'm sorry, Jishnu, that you have to hear this, but what Mercedes pulled on Red Bull actually pulled on Mercedes this time around.
Yeah, they always switch.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't very nice to see when it happens to you. I guess now I finally understand how Max in our podcast feels when his Max Verstappen gets undercut or whatever by Lewis Hamilton. And I'll tell you what, but this actually made for a very interesting race. We got to see the 2 championship leaders battle it out, and in this case, it actually wasn't such a clear strategic decision. Like in Spain and in Hungary, we saw Lewis Hamilton overtake Max Verstappen with a couple of laps to go, like a good number of laps to go. But in this one, it was right up to the penultimate lap when Max Verstappen made that overtake.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was very exciting to see. And I think a couple of laps before the end of the race, we were all texting each other saying, we're not sure who's going to win.
Yeah.
It looks like it could be anyone's game right now.
Yeah.
Because we're not sure when the tires were going to drop off the cliff. Because Max Verstappen, although he did the second pit stop, he pitted for the medium tires, which, to be fair, didn't really last very long in the start of the race. But somehow he managed to maintain those grip levels throughout. And Lewis Hamilton as well, to his credit, I think it must be said, managed to extend the stint on those hard tires for a good 33 laps, I think.
Yeah.
And Valtteri Bottas unfortunately couldn't do as well, which makes me quite unhappy with him, because I feel like if he had defended against Max Verstappen a bit more in the late stages, we could have seen a nice battle right all the way up to the last lap. Unfortunately, Max Verstappen just got an easy overtake on both the Mercedes drivers, with the tyre advantage. So yeah, like Max said, it clearly means, it's not just the drivers or the cars that makes the difference. All these strategies and tyre conditions and weather conditions, all these things actually play a part, and that's what makes the sport very interesting.
That is true. And I think while you might be a bit sad about Bottas not giving his all in defending against Verstappen, I think there were a couple of factors that played, because Bottas, I think he was so pressurized by Verstappen coming into him, or overtaking him, that I think he had a lapse in concentration. He missed a turn, he went out a bit wide, he had to slow down to catch back the racing line, and in doing so, he allowed Verstappen to actually get out ahead of him. Now, I'm going to start some conspiracy over here, because I love conspiracies, they are my thing. But here's the thing, right? Bottas did, say in the radio that he declared, or he kind of, said from outright at the beginning that it was going to be a two-stop race because of how bad the tires were. Leclerc actually did pit twice, very early into the stint for his hard tires, and I think Mercedes should have gambled something with Bottas, or they should have actually gone and pitted Bottas after Perez overtook him, so that they can snatch away the fastest lap from Verstappen. But here's the thing: I think Bottas might have maybe purposely, let Verstappen through because he just had enough nonsense from Mercedes's strategies, So that's a conspiracy from my part. I mean, Max and Jishnu, you guys wanna discuss about that, argue about that? Go ahead.
Now, you can't see, but I think Henil actually has a very shiny tinfoil hat on his head.
Uh-huh.
So I'm just going to say that probably has something to do with his conspiracy theories.
Yeah,
I mean, we saw that, Valtteri Bottas, he just broke a bit too late, I think, into going to the corner, and so lost control of the car. So it's down to the tyre degradation, the graining on the tyres.
Yeah.
And can't be too harsh on him, but although I am unhappy with him. And I think you said Leclerc actually went and did the 2 stops, but somehow he couldn't manage to do the sort of performance that Max Verstappen managed to pull off with the 2 stops. So, like I said, there's a lot of factors playing into this, and I think the Ferraris this weekend just had very dismal race pace because they were not able to keep up with the McLarens or even keep up with the qualifying position because they were both in the points, if I'm not wrong, at the start of the race, and
They
then just dropped out slowly with the tyre grip levels falling out. And Sainz actually managed to stay ahead of Leclerc, and I think that really showed his talent in these low grip conditions, which was nice to see. But I guess that brings us on to the highlight of the day, highlight of the weekend, and driver of the day segment. So Henil, why don't you tell us who's your driver of the day and what's your highlight of the weekend?
I think it's very okay. Honestly, because the race itself was so interesting, a lot more interesting than I ever thought it was going to be. I think my highlight of the weekend itself was the entire race because from the get-go, there were so many different things that were happening. I mean, Norris in the beginning completely, fouling up, like smudging up his start, losing 2 positions, Daniel Ricciardo and Fernando Alonso, and then we had him coming back in the second half of the race. I think one of the biggest highlights of the race, of course, was Aston Martin. I think they pulled off a really brilliant strategical move to keep both Vettel and Stroll out for quite some time. They managed to pull off the overcut quite well. Even in the previous race in Azerbaijan, Baku, they actually did so with Vettel leading the laps for the first time, I think, in forever, what it seemed like. And he managed to come onto the podiums because of a brilliant strategy and a brilliant drive from Aston Martin and Vettel. Similarly, they pulled it off again this weekend and managed to get both the drivers into the points after what was a very, very dismal qualifying for the both of them. So I think my highlight of the weekend is that. My driver of the day would have to be Max Verstappen. He knew just when to push his tires to the maximum. He knew how to defend against Hamilton very, very well. Although at the expense of his tires, he actually managed to keep Hamilton behind him for a very long time. He was able to his outlaps and inlaps during the pit stops were amazing. The strategy call from Red Bull also amazing. So I think my driver of the day was Max Verstappen. What about you, Mac?
Yeah. Well, first thing to point out, I like it how he sneakily sneaked a pun in there. Max Verstappen maxing out his tires. Just had to. So yeah, my driver of the day would actually be Daniel Ricciardo. Simply put it, because he's shown great performance in this race. And it really shows that, he's getting grips of his car, he's slowly getting the hang of it. And if he maintains this performance or even continues to improve even more, McLaren would really then be a solid contender against Ferrari in the championship.
Yeah.
And we can start to see Ricciardo finishing probably in the top 6 consistently as well. The highlight of the race weekend for me was actually a slightly controversial issue. Was during the overtake of Bottas by Perez. So, quick recap was that the point when Perez put on the overtake on Bottas, he did it right before the turn, but coming out into that turn, he was actually out of the track. So that means all 4 wheels were outside of the white lines. So the race stewards did an investigation on that, and in short, they concluded that no further action was given. But for me, I find that Perez was extremely lucky not to have been given a penalty, because it seemed that he went off the track before the overtaking move was completed, before the turn was completed. So that would, in a normal situation, warrant some form of penalty. But in Perez's case, I guess the steward saw that what he did was legal, and he was given he managed to maintain his position.
Yeah.
So that was the highlight actually for me.
Fair enough. I think for
What
our,
about you, Jishnu?
sorry, just to pipe in before that, I think for some of our newer audience, what happens, it's a very similar thing to what happened, with Max Verstappen in Bahrain with Lewis Hamilton with the famous turn 4 incident. The regulation basically states that you aren't allowed to gain an unfair advantage, using anything outside of the track. So with Perez being completely off the track, off the white lines, if his overtake was deemed illegal, it would have been because it would have been deemed that him going off the track was just to get the gain for that extra turns. Sorry, the gain on the turning radius, so he's able to speed fast afterwards. I think it wasn't so controversial in my mind because by the time that Perez was actually off the track, he had already completed the move on Bottas, and it was just more so a fact that because both of them were racing, there wasn't enough space. I believe that it was okay for him to have been ventured off not so far, but like just outside of the racing line. So yeah.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I had to watch the replay a few times just to confirm for myself. And yeah, like you said, actually not really a big of a controversial issue, actually.
Yeah, and I think that's what the FIA also decided, that it was a perfectly fine overtake. But yeah, it definitely was interesting to watch. And as for me, I think my highlight of the weekend is not a particular overtake or a particular incident or anything. I know Henil went and said that his highlight of the weekend was actually the whole weekend itself. I'm not gonna go so far as to say that, but I'm gonna say it's actually the unexpected rate of tyre degradation. I think that actually made the whole race much more exciting. These past few years we just go to France, you know who's gonna win, you know who's gonna finish on the podium, and you know that there's not gonna be much action. But somehow this year, with those unexpected tyre degradation, we saw a really nice strategic battle and a really nice performance by all the drivers, in fact, to manage those tyre degradations and to pull off some amazing overtakes while doing so.
Yeah.
And actually that makes me think, why can't we have this sort of drama and mystery over tyre degradation going into every race, Because usually we go into a race, from the weekend itself, like from Friday and Saturday, you can sort of decide like the race strategy, and whatever AWS says, it's pretty much that's what's going to happen. But this week, I think it was really exciting to see. And I don't know, hopefully we can, have more races like this, where the strategies are not always, where the strategies are not always determined before the race, and they can always be turned upside down on their head at any point in the race.
Yeah.
Yeah, man, absolutely. Like, I don't want a boring race weekend and be able to predict the outcome of Sunday's race just from like qualifying free practice sessions. It would be great for all of us to actually see this kind of unpredictability in all the future races. And yeah, that is why actually for new viewers, you should try watching the season for this year. I honestly think with the new regulations, it will definitely make things more interesting and spice things up a lot.
Yeah, I fully agree. I believe that 2021, the season is going to, I think in the future, is going to be regarded as one of the closest so far, at least, and one of the most interesting starts to any season that has ever been, not any season, but to most seasons that have actually, graced Formula One since its conception, I believe.
I don't know much about the races that I've never watched before, in like the pre-2000 races, I think those might have been pretty insane, but I don't know. Yeah, but you did it. It is quite a very interesting season. It is very unpredictable, and that's what everyone likes to see. And that actually makes my decision for driver of the day a bit difficult, because there are some very brilliant performances all around the grid. Max Verstappen, pretty much all the top four did a very good job with the tyres, with their performance on track, and they were all on solid pace throughout the weekend. And so I'm gonna maybe not stick with those four guys for the driver of the day. I'm gonna go and say, like Max said, it's gonna be Daniel Ricciardo, because after a very troublesome couple of races, right from the offset of the season, he's been struggling to get the grips with the McLaren. But this race weekend, it seems like it just sort of clicked for him, and he was pulling overtakes on Alonso, and that was very nice to see. And I just gotta say, he's my driver of the day for this race.
Fair enough. it seems like I have become the fan of Red Bull, and Max has become the fan of McLaren in the past week or so. But I guess very good point.
Just keeping up with the switcheroos of the weekend.
Yeah, of course, yes.
The whole weekend is all about switcheroo.
Yeah, but yeah, so I think all in all, it's been a very, very interesting race. For those of you who missed it, please do check out the highlights. They'll be found on Formula One's Formula One's YouTube page. And for any of you who have any other highlights of the days or drivers of the days, please let us know in the comment section below, or do drop a comment on our Instagram page. You can also catch us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and other major podcast venues as well. So do keep a lookout if you're not, on either YouTube or Spotify, where most of our listeners come from.
Yep, indeed. And in the event if you have any questions about the technical aspects of Formula One, do drop us a comment as well, and we'll try to explain them in as simple terms as possible. Maybe try to bring in some analogies of ice cream again.
Indeed, Max. I think all of us are looking forward to some of the ice cream references down the road. And just a quick note for all of you listeners out there, we're going to be switching out our podcast format going into the next couple of races. So you guys can actually expect 2 new episodes coming out each weekend. And one of it will be a technical episode where we sort of dive into the sort of content that we explored in this episode. So we'll be discussing things like how did strategy work out for one driver, or how do aerodynamics and tires play such a big role in these strategy decisions. And we'll be exploring a lot of those technical decisions and answering some of your questions too, hopefully. And we're also going to be keeping up with all the banter, the podium predictions, the highlight and the driver of the day. All these stuff will also be going on in our second episode for the weekend, which is going to be a banter episode with all of our special guests joining us every now and then. And do keep a lookout for these changes, and we're very much excited to bring all these new content to you guys. So stick around and listen to us on wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. Hope you have a great week ahead, and please stay safe.
This is hot, yeah?
And on that great note, goodbye.